Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, we have back on the show one of my favorite guests, recurring guests on Rev Left, Two Black, who is a poet, an organizer, an intellectual, writes essays, is on the Black Myths podcast, and recently wrote an essay that is on grassrootsthinking.com, and I'm sure some other places as well, entitled Nonviolence is Violence Too, Somebody's Gotta Die. It's, I think, a really historically dialectical, materialist analysis of the seeming binary between violence and nonviolence. The way that we talk about violence and nonviolence and think about those two things are often as two separate spheres, as two wholly opposite things that we either pick one or the other to the exclusion of the one that we didn't pick. And I think Two Black complicates that in a really generative and analytical way, using a sort of dialectical materialist approach to the seeming binary. And I think the discussion we have about this is, genuinely deep. I think the stuff that you're going to hear in the next hour or two of this conversation takes a topic that many of you have probably thought about, probably talked about, and deepens it and complicates it and adds nuance to it in a way that I think is rare and genuinely unique. So I think this brings a certain depth and clarity to a well-treaded conversation that is incredibly worth it, especially at this moment of extreme violence in our society. I talk about this a little bit up front, from the releasing of the Epstein files and the violence of the U.S. and Israeli ruling classes, the genocide in Gaza, the seeming imminent possible attack on Iran, the violence and murder of ICE in the streets of Minneapolis and across the country, the violence of the detention centers, etc. We're living in an incredibly violent fucking system that every single day, in order for it to continue on, it costs human life. It's like human life is what we pump into the engine of this system. And the daily grinding violence that is necessitated by its very existence and continuation needs to be seen and looked at very, very clearly. And only then can we begin to actually talk about the possibilities of revolutionary violence or non-violent strategies against the system. So whatever you think on that topic, this conversation will add new wrinkles to it that almost certainly you haven't considered in the same way that I hadn't considered a lot of the stuff that we do get into. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Two Black on his latest essay, Nonviolence is Violence Too. Somebody's Gotta Die.
Yeah, I'm Two Black, poet, author, organizer, host of the Black Myths podcast. Just recently wrote essay. This is part one of two parts, actually. The essay being called Nonviolence is Violence Too, Somebody's Gotta Die.
Yeah, it's a really interesting essay. I think it grapples with not only the question of violence and nonviolence and the sort of the dialectic between them, but a lot of the major figures that those of us on, the Marxist left in particular will be familiar with, and the different sort of strategies employed by them in the face of the overwhelming violence of the capitalist imperialist state. This is also, I think, an interesting moment to have a discussion like this for so many reasons. We've seen the ICE protests and the resistance to it. We've seen the state murder people in the streets and have no accountability. We see what they're doing in West Asia, funding and arming the genocide in Gaza, making moves now on Iran, just an incredibly violent system. And we're speaking about 2 days out from the most recent release of a tranche of Epstein files, showing that the entire, or at least large factions of the ruling class in this country in the economic and political spheres have engaged or have been adjacent to the engagement of human sex trafficking, pedophilia, and just acts of unspeakable violence against the most powerless people on the planet. So it's sort of a macabre but important moment, I think, to discuss this issue in particular. The essay itself, of course, is titled, as you said, Nonviolence is Violence Too, Somebody's Gotta Die, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I guess like to start off, obviously a lot of people won't have read the essay before listening to this podcast, although I'll link to it in the show notes. People should read it and grapple with it in detail. But can you introduce us to this essay, some of the historical figures that you are wrestling with, and what you mean by the claim that nonviolence is violence too?
Yeah, it's interesting you brought those events up because this was actually conceived of months ago. I just knew it was going to take some time to write it. The goal was actually have it out by MLK Day, but there were still some edits that needed to be done. So it ends up dropping the same day that the last his name is slipping me. The nurse who was killed in Minneapolis. It ends up dropping the same day that occurred, and it was no intent to time that. Obviously, no one knew exactly when that was coming, even though, as we'll get to, the violence is inevitable in these kind of situations. So the timing was kind of eerie because, I'm not one of those people that likes to write stuff to exploit tragedies like some scholars do. Like, that's never been my thing. So it was kind of took me back for a second, honestly, when it actually hit me like that it dropped the same day. But at the same time, taking myself out of it, I think it was relevant to kind of grapple with what occurred.
Yeah.
In terms of what I mean by nonviolence and violence too, I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can go here. Some of what I'll say is in the essay, some of it's not. But I guess for me, particularly since I'm on this podcast, it comes down to this question of idealism versus materialism, per usual. So this is a materialist analysis of so-called nonviolence, and when I feel like when you look at it materially, it doesn't really hold up that there's somehow nonviolence involved because it requires violence to be successful. From the idealist perspective, if you are simply thinking about the intention of someone who goes into a protest and decides not to carry a gun or not to shoot a gun or not to cause any physical harm to their opponent, then from that perspective, I guess you could say it's nonviolent. But as we'll get to in later in the discussion, often what requires violence to or nonviolence to work is the opponent has to be violent. Nonviolence at its best is about confronting power, and in this case, we're talking about capitalism, right? So capitalism is inherently violent. Imperialism is inherently violent, and when you confront these things when you confront them about their violence, they will react violently, and that is often what brings people to your side, right? That is often what galvanizes more people. So you mentioned Minneapolis. Unfortunately, the murder of two people within a week and a half or 2 weeks. There was others murdered as well, but the high profile murders of particularly two white folks brought more attention to what's happening in Minneapolis, and has brought more people into the streets. And now there are real considerations for general strikes, and more people are getting involved in organizing. And even the Trump administration, for a moment there, had to retreat a bit in their strategy in Minneapolis. They had to fire one of the people who was over it at the time and bring in a new guy and say they're going to do targeted operations. Most of this is PR. It's not that they're really retreating materially, but they have to push out the idea that, we kind of messed up here because they said that this man was wielding a weapon and he came to kill officers, and all of us watched the video. We could see that's not what happened. So nonviolence, as people think of it, has this effect of bringing on more people, but it requires someone to, as I say in the essay, die or to be harmed or to be hurt. And if ICE was peaceful we're talking about how this looks, not more so how it actually functions, but if ICE was not putting on, these grand stages of raiding Home Depots and was just doing what they did under Biden and Obama, there wouldn't be anybody in the streets. So this creates a bit of a contradiction that if it's not violence, why does it seem that violence is the thing that brings more people to the cause? And if that's the case, then materially, for me, I don't think that could be nonviolence. So when I'm talking about the idealism versus materialism, it's like, I think Ingalls has said something to the effect of people take the concept somehow starts to paint the object instead of the object painting the concept. I'm paraphrasing. So nonviolence becomes a thing where the idea of it, that someone is behaving peacefully and someone is not hurting somebody, the idea of that, I think, moves people, that you are somehow standing above the gunk, as I get into a bit in my second essay. But when we actually look at what occurs, it's not just the individual's intentions, it's the fact that you have to provoke the worst of your enemy to bring about the most change usually. And the less you're able to do that, the less people are really interested in getting involved, because they don't really deem it necessary, particularly in the United States, where people have been so desensitized to violence. You have to really ratchet it up for people to be involved. We've been hearing the word fascism for years, and I've debated whether I think that's the way people frame it, at least, has always been helpful. But nonetheless, like, words have been thrown around for years and people didn't really take it seriously. But then when something like this happens in the streets, then all of a sudden, even the Atlantic is like, well, actually, this might be fascism now, right? Like, but now, again, there's a lot of contradictions even in that, because we could talk about, Maduro being kidnapped. We could talk about what's happening, like you said, in Israel. We can talk about all those different things and how that violence doesn't somehow seem to shock people in the same way sometimes. Nonetheless, what it shows in this case is that nonviolence it requires, we can get into more details later, but it requires some kind of violent reaction to really be successful, particularly nonviolent action, particularly like civil disobedience. Now, if we're talking about a visual or just writing a letter or putting out a statement or some of those things that Gene Sharp talks about in his books, I think he has like 178 different types of nonviolence. Like, individual forms of it may not always lead to that, but anything that is actually confronting power and forcing power to have to make a move, you almost need power to react in its worst forms to demonstrate why other people need to be involved and why it needs to be defeated.
Yeah, and we're going to get into more of the details. I think what comes out already, and if you read the essay, it comes out even more, is like, and you've kind of made this explicit, that there is this dialectical materialist analysis of violence and nonviolence that is much deeper and more analytical than the conversations and discourse that usually surrounds the topic, which, as you say, is often idealist, right? Like two totally separate categories of behavior juxtaposed to one another as always in opposition to one another, and you get to pick which one you do or don't agree with.
Right.
And that's the sort of childish way, I think, of looking at the topic, and you complicate it in all the right ways. Before we get into this, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say just quickly, and it's like that was part of the argument is I think we need to move on from that binary of nonviolence versus violence, because as I said in the essay, I think it's actually immaterial. You are in a violent situation nonetheless, and the only question is really, how do you choose to confront it, right? But you are in that situation nonetheless. If I go up to a cop, and stand in front of a cop and don't put any hands on the cop is still standing there with a gun. Even if the cop doesn't pull their gun, they're still standing there with a gun. I'm in a violent situation. Mm-hmm. Like, I've not avoided that at any point. Now, maybe I don't, respond in the same exact way, and that's an individual choice, but the actual material interaction is still violence. And it can get very violent even if I don't pull any kind of like deadly weapon, right? And it's somehow, like you said, the idealist part of it doesn't deal with the actual circumstance as a whole. It reduces it to the individual and their ability to make a choice how they want to move. And it's not to take away from people's personal like morals or their autonomy. I think that's important, but I just don't think that the whole situation can be understood as nonviolent. I just don't think that actually explains anything.
Yeah. Absolutely. Before we get into this next question about sacrificial violence, which I think is an interesting concept and core to the argument, I'm just kind of curious, like outside the outline itself, like was there anything in particular that prompted you to think and write on this topic, or was it something that's just been simmering in your mind for years, or what prompted you to write about this?
Yeah, I was, I do work with political prisoners, and I was talking to one of my comrades who works on the campaign for the Pendleton 2, which I've talked about on this podcast. It's two political prisoners here in Indiana, where I'm from, Naeem Trotter and John Balagoon Cole, who received over 200 plus years combined for intervening to save a fellow prisoner in 1985 at Pendleton Prison, who was being beaten by guards. We later find out are in the Klan. They actually did not, they didn't kill anyone in that situation. They simply intervened to defend him. Nonetheless, that turned into them getting 200 plus years. So I've been involved in that campaign for a while. I was talking to somebody, involved in that campaign, and we were actually talking about Palestine, but we were just talking about this kind of like missing point that we see in when people want to talk about like innocence or things of that nature in relation to Palestine, and how with the, people will want to condemn Hamas, so they want to condemn resistance, and then they'll say, but the genocide must stop. And even without getting into the condemn Hamas conversation so much, it's just, I think if you zoom out a little bit, what people are saying is almost as if there's not some kind of force that needs to be applied very materially. Like, it's almost as if that doesn't happen. It's just like we all get to just say this is bad, but we don't have to really acknowledge what it will take to end it. Like, that part never really gets addressed. So everybody gets to be on the right moral side, but we don't have to acknowledge that there is a force that needs to take place. So we were talking about that, and then it just led to, I think I had said in the conversation, and he had said it as well, like, even when you look at, nonviolent, so-called nonviolent movements, they have to confront these things, and usually it still requires a form of violence to move things along, or to at least bring attention to the situation, even if they're not fully successful with ending whatever they're fighting against. So we were saying, like, in any case, there has to be a confrontation with violence, but it's also the fact that there has to be some kind of force involved, even for the people who like to claim the peaceful side or something of that nature, right? Like, it requires it nonetheless. So it made me think about, just from there, I just wanted to write something on it, because I've noticed it for years. It's always kind of struck me as odd that when I look at the history books, whether it's in the civil rights movement, whether it's in India, this essay, particularly the second one, is going to deal a bit with Ghana and positive action. It's never this clean, everybody just walks the streets and is nice, and then they got what they wanted. Like, people had to die, people had to be slaughtered, people had to be harmed and hurt. And that part is always just seen as this kind of utility to uplift nonviolence. But I'm like, if there was blood shed, then again, it just seems like if there's a contradiction here that we're not really addressing. And for folks who are new to it, it's almost like we're not being honest with them and really telling them what they're getting involved with. And when you go look at like the civil rights movement, they were very clear on what they were entering into. Like, there was anybody that, these are people who were trained. If they were going to do a bus boycott, if they were going to do go to a segregated lunch counter, if they were going to do a freedom ride, like, these are people who were trained and prepared for the violence of the South, for the violence of the Klan. Like, they knew what was coming. And then in freedom rides, people even had to write wills. James Bevel had people write wills before they got on the bus that he had to turn into their family if something happened, because he said, I'm not going to let you get on the bus if I can't explain to your people why you died. Like, you have to have a good reason. So they were very clear on this, but I think nonviolence somehow hides that part of it, and it's as if you get to stand above the violence, and it's like, no, you're actually entering into it. You're not standing above it. You're here with it like everyone else, no matter how they choose to confront it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that leads in, and you've already kind of started addressing this idea, but you propose explicitly in the essay a renaming nonviolence as sacrificial violence. And again, you just kind of touched on that, but what exactly qualifies a tactic or a campaign as sacrificial violence? And what does that term let us see that, as you say, nonviolence, the term nonviolence obscures?
We can walk it back a little bit. In the essay, we talk about philosophy, or it's nonviolence as a philosophy versus nonviolence as a tactic. This is something that has been, I think, used to sometimes explain the differences of how people approach it. So nonviolence as a philosophy, comes out of the more like Gandhian tradition, or and then Dr. King and Lawson and many others within the civil rights movement picked that up, and that is more so the idea that living one's life nonviolently overall, there's a certain philosophy that in how you approach that, and you try to avoid violence in all manners, at least ideally. And it's also that you can suffer and show your opponent that their ways are wrong. Like if someone was to hit you, you can somehow demonstrate to them by not responding, you can actually show them that they're wrong and that they can change their ways. It's a form of redemption, right? That's the philosophy. So you believe overall that people can be changed by your non-response to violence, or by you being even kind in response to you you loving your enemy and turning the other cheek. That's the philosophical concept of it. Tactically, it's different. You may not necessarily believe that people's hearts can be changed more broadly, but you understand, like as we've already been talking about, that by like one, you may not have a military, right? You may not have the arms or ability to fight on that front anyway. It's kind of a form of guerrilla warfare, honestly. But so you say, okay, we can't fight in that way, but what we can do is not follow any of these laws. We can simply not go to work, or we can simply not buy any of these things, or we can simply not attend any of these things that may belong to the enemy. And then when the enemy hits us, we can decide not to hit back, because, again, we know that will bring attention, and that will heighten the contradiction of what we're up against, and that can hopefully bring more people to our side. You're not necessarily interested really in changing the heart of the enemy as much as you're trying to change the heart of others watching your enemy and see if you can get them involved. And that's something that different nonviolent movements have applied. So those are the differences. And then Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, the late Kwame Ture, talked about, it's probably people have seen this quote going around on the internet that in order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. Mm-hmm. If you go back and watch the full, I've never been able to actually find the full speech, but the full clip of that speech, he talks about Dr. King more so applying it philosophically and feeling like you can suffer and you can take pain and harm, and your opponent will be changed by witnessing what they're doing to you. Like, they will stop and see the wrong of their ways. And then he says, he only made one fallacious assumption, is that, in order for that to work, your opponent must have a heart in the United States, or have a conscience, and the United States has none, which I don't disagree with that. But what I was trying to advance in the essay, not necessarily disagreeing with him, is that, again, if you break it down between philosophy and tactic, the opponent doesn't necessarily need to have a heart if, you and I are involved in a struggle and we're trying to get other people involved to fight the opponent. We don't care if the opponent has a heart. We actually prefer, to my point earlier about them being violent, we prefer they don't have a heart, because the less of a heart they have, the more likely we might be to even move people to our side. But what unites both the philosophy and the tactic is the opponent must be violent, right? That's what unites them at the end of the day, is that even whether it's a philosophy or tactic to really change the opponent or to even change the circumstance, even though your goal is not to change the opponent has to be violent for any kind of transformation to occur, which again demonstrates that violence is part of it. The opponent has to overreact or do something that that heightens the contradiction. And, that's normally not going to be them being nice back to you, right? That's just not the way it works. So, Dr. King and others, Gandhi, if you read some of their statements, they're very open about this being a kind of a sacrificial thing. Like Gandhi said, we are entering upon a life and death struggle, a holy war. We are performing an all-embracing sacrifice in which we wish to offer ourselves as oblation. Dr. King said the way of nonviolence means a willingness to suffer and sacrifice. And he talks about offering, these are different quotes in different moments, offering the body as a weapon. And, James Lawson said something to the effect that, we wanted to end the cycle of violence, so we say we will take violence upon ourselves to end it. So for all of them, James Lawson, for those who don't know, was also a Ghanaian student, and he was studied in India, and he eventually he trains what was called the Nashville student movement, where all the sit-ins against like lunch counters and stuff happened. and he was the one who trained a lot of the folks that were involved in that, and was also just broadly involved in the movement. So these are the practitioners of nonviolence, and they all speak to this kind of sacrifice and seem to have a certain clarity about violence that today we don't really get when people talk about nonviolence. So for me, it was like, well, looking at it materially, you're actually sacrificing your body and sacrificing yourself, knowing that there will be a reaction, sacrificing yourself to bring about that violence to achieve some set of specific goals. So in the piece it said, we can understand sacrificial violence as an act where one foments the violence of their opponent and then willfully consumes it as a sacrifice for a specific set of objectives. So you are consuming this violence, knowing that it's coming, knowing that this is going to happen. So for me, that's more sacrificial. And that was really me trying to, I don't think it's the perfect term. I don't particularly care if people take it up or not. It's more so trying to respect what I read nonviolence to be at its best. Like, this is not a piece to bash it or to say, just run out with guns. That's not what I was going for here. So I didn't want to call it like suicidal violence or recklessness, or because I don't think that's what it is. Mm-hmm. It is saying, it's kind of trying to combine the idealist with the materialist, kind of like, it is saying I'm willing to sacrifice myself for a greater cause, but I do need violence to do it. Even if that's not how they fully explicitly said it, that's really what happens. So it's like it's a sacrificial form of violence because I'm taking the violence on myself and then you hoping that the violence that occurs upon me can bring more people in and can hopefully end the injustice that I'm fighting. That's more how I understand it, as opposed to nonviolence, because again, that doesn't actually seem what's really happening here. So I hope that gives some clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to reiterate that point you made at the end. This is not like some sort of intellectualized screed against nonviolence. You're taking the arguments incredibly seriously. You're seeing the strategic sort of approach and orientation of it. You're giving like full credence to the advocates of such a strategy, especially in the case of the civil rights movement, that they knew exactly what they were doing. And this is not something that they're naively going into like wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. They knew what it entailed. And so I really respect that part of the analysis as well. And I just kind of want to make explicit really quick before we move on, the causal chain of sacrificial violence, more or less as you lay out in the text. So I'll just read it so that the listener kind of understands what's going on, and you can correct me if I get anything wrong here. But step one in this causal chain is the confrontation, right? We'll talk about this in a second, but the movement in one way or another pokes the bear, i.e. it sort of threatens power in some way. The second step is provocation, that the opponent reacts with lethal repression, which we'll talk about more here in a second. The third step is sacrifice. The practitioner consumes the violence, as you said, without retaliating violently. 4, amplification. The dramatization of evil goes viral, and we'll talk about an example of that later in this conversation. And then ideally, number 5 would be the concession, that the state public is forced to act out of necessity, not out of conscience, right? Never in American history, for example, or we could extrapolate this to other contexts, is that when the state is acting, it's not out of like some come to Jesus moment where the light dawns on them and the power of the moral argument convinces them. It is always necessity. I even talk about like the New Deal, right? It was not some like FDR didn't come to power with all these wonderful ideas about helping the regular person. It was a concession made by the U.S. state in a specific context where not only did you have an external alternative like the Soviet Union in play, but also within the U.S. itself, you had a robust and increasingly militant communist movement that, arising and flourishing in the context and wake of the Great Depression, that was a real threat to power. And so the concessions of the New Deal was the system itself kind of being backed in a corner, having an external alternative on display for the whole world to see, and an internal mass movement gaining lots of credence and power and mass support. And so the New Deal was not FDR coming to some sort of moral realization. It was the system as a whole reacting out of necessity precisely to save the system. And I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but FDR said, I've heard this said, and you can look this up, and I don't know if it's apocryphal, but that his greatest achievement was saving capitalism, that the New Deal was meant to save capitalism in the face of a genuine communist challenge. And so is that causal chain correct, and do you more or less agree with how I laid it out?
Yeah, I actually appreciate that because I never thought about it honestly in a sense of, since I was writing about it more philosophically, I guess I didn't think about it in a sense of steps. So if you got that, send that to me after the interview.
Yeah, for sure.
You wrote that down, I think that is a good characterization of it in terms of there is we think about how it plays out. Yeah, that's how it has to go in some way, shape, or form. And obviously it varies depending on the literal circumstance that one thing happens versus another. But yeah, you have to, like I said, there's a causal chain. You have to create a reaction. There's a cause and effect that's happening here. And if that doesn't occur, these things are often stifled, or they're not really able to grow because you're trying to, you cannot force that concession because power feels as if there's no real threat here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you have to create some kind of crisis, some kind of threat for it to occur. I think some of the downsides of that is you go through all of this, and at best you might get a concession.
Mm-hmm.
At best you may, and the concession may not always be strong enough. Or, as we know with like the New Deal, or as I talked about even with laundering, there's a way that as history moves on, we almost forget that that's like the way you laid out the New Deal. We forget that that's what occurred. And we do think that FDR came in with great ideas and that's what happened. We do think that the New Deal is the best thing ever, as opposed to, like you said, it's just a concession. Because the downside here is your nonviolence often is not, it has some troubles when it's time to actually take power. It's good at heightening contradictions. It's not necessarily always the best at governing once those contradictions are heightened. Like that's some of the problems it runs into. And even once it does govern, as maybe we get to more a bit later, it's not going to be able to govern in the same way that it rose to power. So it's not going to be able to govern in this kind of so-called nonviolent way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's not how you defend your revolution, right? Or that's not how you defend your movement. But yeah, I definitely think that that's a good characterization. So I don't even really feel like I need to add much more.
Yeah, and quickly, once the internal threat sort of subsided, had been co-opted, the concession had been made, the fire was tamped down a little bit internally, we got what we now refer to retroactively as the rise of neoliberalism, but in so many ways it was a conscious dismantling of the New Deal by the ruling class. So the moment they could, they took all that shit back, proving that it was always just a concession and that they were forced into it, and then the moment they weren't forced into it anymore or didn't have to maintain it, they dismantled it. So
and that's the challenge, right? Is how do you help people remember?
Yeah,
because I'm even seeing that even now with like looking back at 2020, as I've talked about on here. When I was on here last time, we talked about DEI and how now people are defending things that were actually meant to pacify them because those things are being taken away.
mm-hmm.
So it's also another causal chain, to think about in terms of you do all this, they send you something to pacify you. And then you somehow forget, and now you're defending the thing. Now you're defending the pacification, right? Like that's exactly. That's an odd circumstance that you find, particularly in America, happens pretty often. I think as I described in the last essay, it was bootleg rehab, right? It was a drug dealer who starts a rehab center, and then another drug dealer comes in to take the rehab center, and you start organizing to keep the rehab center that's funded by a drug dealer, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't actually make any sense, but that's often what we get into. And I think, coming back even to the beginning, I think some of that is the idealism of the United States in terms of it's the way we remember history. We don't remember it materially. We remember it as heroes and villains and, comic book story kind of things, right? So we don't remember the actual events that got us to something. We just kind of maybe remember the end result of it, or we don't even know in some cases. Even it's not even always about remembering. We don't know the events that got us to something. So that's my worry in this moment, in terms of Minneapolis and elsewhere, honestly, is people forget 2020 already, and we're just 6 years, not even really 6 years removed from George Floyd, and people forget that. And now, because ICE is so bad, people are love the cops again because they're local.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, and I think it's very strange that that's happening in the city with that almost abolished police, right? So there's this tendency. I think nonviolence, unfortunately, does contribute to that because it doesn't, because it's always dealing with, it's trying to get you to look at higher ideals and higher like forms of morality, which are important, but because it tries to stand above, I think, too much in its rhetoric, not so much in its actions, but in its rhetoric, it tries to stand above the fray. And sometimes I think that gets people to the point where they don't actually look at what's materially occurring. They think about all these ideals that they could just impose on the world, and we don't learn anything with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on a zoomed out level, like liberalism is idealist, and if liberalism is the dominant ideological hegemon, the narratives that will be produced by liberalism will be idealist, and that's true in the Civil War, it's true in the Revolutionary War, it's true about the New Deal, etc. And that is also why materialism is a threat to liberalism and the liberal ideological hegemony, is precisely because it digs deeper and reveals what liberalism obscures.
Yeah, definitely.
But let's move forward, and I'll ask a two-part question here so you can take it in any direction you want. I'm interested to hear about, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Chenoweth's findings that regimes responded with lethal repression in 88% of nonviolent revolutions from 1900 to 2019. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that statistic. And then I would like for you to kind of flesh out the honey and the bear sort of metaphor that you use that I think, is powerful as well.
Yeah, so I don't know if I say her name correctly either. I'm bad with names, but yeah, Chenoweth, I believe is how you say it. But that the statistic comes out of the book Civil Resistance, and wait, that's the chapter name. Hold on, look. Yeah, Civil Resistance, what everyone needs to know. Yeah, that's the name of the book, Civil Resistance, what everyone needs to know. It came out in 2021. They actually have some pretty interesting research if you just want to look at the research itself, and they look at violent and nonviolent revolutions from 1900 to 2019. I think originally they had one, I think it started and maybe they had one that went up to 2006. And then since then, they've just continued to grow the information. I don't have all the metrics down on the top of my head in terms of how they measured that. But I know in that specific instance, she was able to track these different movements and show that even when they were nonviolent, there was some kind of violent response. Now, to be fair, she does demonstrate that movements that are explicitly like violent armed struggle tend to have more casualties than movements that are nonviolent.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still not a case for nonviolence. It just means that maybe more escalated form of violence will bring about more repression, right? But for me, that statistic stood out because it shows, as I opened the piece with, that, that history teaches us that violence is an inevitable consequence of nonviolent action. So if 88% of the time in so-called nonviolent revolutions, some kind of repression occurred, then violence is almost always a response to it. So it's just something you should be expecting at this point. She even says, I think, later in that piece or later in that book that nonviolent movements have experienced I think 23% of the time have experienced mass killings, which is 1,000 deaths or more. So not just a few protesters here and there, but you're talking about like over 1,000 people and more that have killed. That was between 1955 and 2013. Nearly 1 in 4 nonviolent revolutions and overturning regime endured mass killings at some point. That's a direct quote from the book. So nearly 25%, 23%. So this was something that, for me, I was just trying to look for something that could verify the observation that I was making maybe more anecdotally. And I was just saying, okay, is there anything that can verify this beyond just a few case studies? And I felt like that statistic verified that it is an inevitable consequence and often even welcomed. Like Gandhi, for instance, during the Salt March was, there was various campaigns that happened under the Indian independence movement, which is also has a lot of contradictions in terms of so-called violence and nonviolence. But during the Salt March, where it was a whole thing about British salt and not buying it because it was imposed on the Indians. So there was a big march against that and trying to get people in mass to oppose it and to really oppose all British customs. But it was a 24-day march. But during that march, he literally told his protesters or his marchers to not even block themselves when they were beaten by the British. So, at least in the civil rights movement, they were taught to like cover their heads. He was like, don't even do that. So that's what I mean by it's actually welcomed in some cases. Because you're trying to really exaggerate the point, right? So for me, it just seemed to be a statistic that since I was writing an essay and not a book, I don't have time to go through every revolution or every movement. So that statistic for me, I think just summarized the point that the cause and effect, the causal chain that we've been talking about here.
Yeah, I have a thought as you were speaking and you were talking about those statistics. It's you made it clear that in nonviolent movements, there's an overall, there's an objectively lower body count, right? Even when the nonviolence is met with violence, the overall amount of casualties is significantly lower than when violence is met with violence, which we would expect. But I have an interesting thought here, which is that if you're doing a nonviolent movement and you're met with violence, there's less overall casualties. But I would argue that it makes logical sense that maybe 90 to 100% of those casualties are taken and absorbed by the nonviolent movement. So there's lower amount of harm overall, but almost all the harm is on the side of the nonviolent movement. Now, if you meet violence with violence, there's a higher number of casualties, an increase in overall harm. But perhaps, and I think this makes logical sense, the casualties are on both sides, right? When you think about John, this is just one example. We'll talk about Palestine in a second, which I think is another example, horrifyingly so. But in John Brown's movement, right? If John Brown and his comrades were doing nonviolent methods against a rabid slave state and all the fascist enslavers that supported it, like Bleeding Kansas, like if John Brown's side of that was nonviolent, there might have been less casualties overall, but it would have been on the side of John Brown and his comrades who would have taken the brunt of that violence. John Brown and his comrades went out, killed people. Overall, the body count goes way up. And ultimately, of course, John Brown himself is hung and many of his comrades killed. But they took out several, a lot of slavers and what we would call fascists today, defenders of slavery and those that were attempting to flood into Kansas to make it a slave state. So that's just a calculus that seems objectively true, and what you think about that, you can make up your own mind as to what you think is more worthwhile, but there is something to be said. Meeting violence with violence means that their side suffers too, right?
Yeah, I don't take that statistic as an endorsement really of one side or the other. Sure. More so just like to your point, it's just thinking about how the puzzle pieces might fit together differently. Right. Like, but that's why I ground the piece in this is ultimately a matter of confrontation. Mm-hmm. That's why if we're talking that's why I don't think the debate of violence and nonviolence is that deep or really even useful, because ultimately it comes down to you're going to have to confront this, and we'll get to that in the next question, but you're going to have to confront this thing. Right. So on a nonviolent point, if you are, or as I call sacrificial violent point, you can weigh do we really want to take the cost of losing that many people? And do we want, if you're thinking about it philosophically or spiritually, do we want to bear the brunt of taking that many lives? Like these are questions that you can genuinely wrestle with. If you are not of that persuasion and you're like, this is what we got to do, we got to pick up arms, you still wrestle with those same questions. Like that's another thing that annoys me about nonviolence sometimes is they act like they're the only ones that care about life or something.
Uh-huh.
Like I mean, again, I've tried to be respectful and not take shots at it, but when we read some of the literature, that was one of the things that stood out, was this sense that people that pick up arms don't consider the toll of their fight, right? Like they're just willing to just go and bloodshed, but because we're not willing to shoot or punch anybody, we don't take on the weight of or we care about the weight of other lives being passed. And it's like, that's not, anyone that's approached this from any sense of actually caring about the people they're fighting for always take on that cost. They're always considering it.
Absolutely.
Right? Like that's not something that's lost on them. But there's a way that the violence is made to be bloodthirsty and almost mindless, and nonviolence is made to be this caring thing. And I think that just like the people who are proponents of nonviolence don't like to be called weak or soft or or immature or whatever. All the different ways that they're casted, in negatively. They don't like those terms. Well, I don't think violence should be casted in that way necessarily either. Like people who are more, I should just say, explicitly violent, I don't think should be casted that way. Anyone who's fighting a power and trying to overcome that takes that seriously and is not just looking to duplicate the thing they're fighting. Anyone that does that is always considering the amount of lives that have to be shed or something, but they're making a calculation, just like nonviolent folks make a calculation that it's worth getting beat up to achieve their goal. They're making a calculation that it's worth losing certain lives to achieve that goal, right? Like, these are questions that everyone wrestles with. Neither side has some kind of moral high ground over the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so, we can touch on this question as well, because early on you say that confrontation with power makes bloodshed imminent, and you raise up this metaphor of poking a bear over honey. Can you talk about that metaphor and what makes violence so structurally likely in your view through that metaphor?
Yeah, the quote was, if one confronts a bear over who controls the honey, the bear will kill to control it. The raging bear does not care if the struggle is armed or nonviolent. It's a simple equation. Once the bear is poked, bloodshed is imminent. In the end, somebody's got to die for the honey. So it's just to say that if I want to rob your home, and for whatever reason I decided to come in there without any weapons, I thought I could just do it while you're asleep or something, you will still shoot me if you have a gun if I'm in your home, because you're trying to protect your family. If I go into your home and I show up with a gun, you will still try to protect yourself because I'm in your home, right? Like, you're not going to let me take anything, like you're going to try to protect yourself, especially if you have some kind of weapon on you. So we're talking about a bear, not just a regular person, right? A bear who has a lot of power physically. If you try to mess with a bear's honey, they're not going to just, it doesn't matter how you try to steal their honey. They're going to respond, violently. So these debates that we have about armed or non-armed struggle or whatever are not relevant to the bear. It's just a question of how they maintain their honey. So we're talking about capital, and you ultimately want to challenge anything related to capital. They'll deal with you differently only as much as it advances their goals, but they don't really care about that much if at the end of the day you're trying to take something that is important to their entire world, and that's capital, right? That's control over the means of production. That's all those things. So if you want to confront that in any form, even if you're doing it to just say we want equal rights in the South, well, we know that wasn't just about hate and a bunch of rednecks. That there was real money invested in that. There was a certain social order that was being disrupted. People are not going to respond nicely to that. When Dr. King takes it a step further and doesn't just confront the South, but confronts the U.S. empire, he's dead within a year of the speech against Vietnam. Like, that's how they're going to respond. This is proven out by the statistic that we just talked about. A bear wants to protect its honey. The honey is whatever is important to your enemy. The honey is whatever is the red line for your enemy, for your opponent. And then again, in the world of capitalism and imperialism, where it's pretty clear what the red line is for them. And when that line is crossed, they're going to respond in whatever they have to do to defend it and to maintain that. And they're going to put whoever down that they need to put down to do it. Sometimes they'll buy people off. Yes. Sometimes it's not always explicit violence, but even when they're buying somebody off, somebody's usually dying alongside that. That's how they juxtapose it, right? So that's just the ultimate reality of what we're dealing with. And I think to cast it any differently is not being honest with people about what they're walking into when they go to the streets to protest or anything of that nature. Now, if you go to protest something that isn't very important to capital, then you might get a concession that doesn't really require a lot of violence or any at all, you know. Hence why we can get certain forms of representation, or we can get acknowledgement statements. These things don't cost people anything. But if it's something that really costs them, they're going to respond hostile, right? They're going to respond in a hostile way. And that's something that people need to be prepared for. And they don't discriminate against how you confront them. Yeah. If you confront them, that's all they're really worried about. How you confronted them is secondary to the fact that you are willing to confront them.
Absolutely, yeah. And two quick points on that. Well, one quick point is that, I think this applies directly to anybody that is a democratic socialist or anything like that, which, I'm not hating or anything. I'm just presenting you with a contradiction, which is that there's an implicit belief on behalf of many democratic socialists that, and they're rising in the institutions, people that are self-proclaimed democratic socialists rising within the political system, which is that if we do it the right way, if we do it democratically, we follow law, we win elections, we rally the people, that we'll eventually be able to do something that threatens the bear's honey without provoking the bear. Because, hey, we did it all the right way. We didn't do it violently. We didn't steal it from you. We did it through the democratic mechanisms and the legal order that you yourself laid out and said is legitimate. But the truth is, and we've seen this time, we saw it in Chile, for example, which is the moment you get close to the honey, no matter if, as you said, you do it peacefully, democratically, and legally, or you do it any other way, if you actually threaten that honey, you will be met with overwhelming violence. And so there's a certain sort of delusion on behalf of people who think they can do it peacefully, that they won't be met with violence, and therefore they're not prepared for it. And my only thing to people like that is just to be like, you have to be prepared for it. In the same way that Salvador Allende did everything right, did it the right way, even stepped back from the precipice of arming the workers and making this more explicitly violent, and he was still killed for it. And his entire political project was drowned in blood regardless, because he got too close to the honey, and it doesn't matter how you do it. And the second point that I think is really good about this metaphor, the bear is representative of a system, meaning the bear is an animal in this metaphor. It has no individual conscience or personal moral deliberation that an individual might have. It is a perfect representation of the instincts of a system, because the system operates at a higher level than any individual within it. And so, the bear is this sort of animal driven by instinct to protect its honey, in the same exact way that the capitalist imperialist system is not an individual morally deliberating, but is as instinctual in some ways as an animal itself. And so there is no reasoning with a system in the same way that there's a way that you can reason with an individual, and there's no reasoning with a bear like you can reason with the person, right?
Right, yeah. You said a lot of things there that are dope I want to touch on. Like, it speaks to kind of, when we're talking about the strategy and tactic, or the philosophy and tactic, like you were using DSA as an example, but that's kind of a scaled up version of what that is, right? Like, so there's the going into the streets and, trying to confront the South, or trying to confront the racist police or something. But like you said, on a scaled up version it is an entire political party that, and again, this is not to disparage it or whatever. It's just dealing with the reality, like I said, materially, that if you do things through the correct mechanisms, and you just have a great strategy, and you just, show that you're willing to play ball, but you're also going to do it with, ethics or something, right? And you just try to work a little bit for the people, that will inherently somehow, like, prove that this is the way. Right. And that's very idealist. It's been tested many times and doesn't seem to work. But in doing that, you also will see how people lose the plot a bit. So originally you might have entered into as a tactic. Like, we're going to run under the Democratic Party because that's the easiest way to get on the ballot. And yes, we know the Democratic Party sucks or something. We're going to run on the ballot so we can get our name out there. And then we're going to take over the party, or maybe we even break from the party. Like, this is the kind of stuff you'll hear.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get in the party, and now, like we saw under Biden, now because Biden elected some of your people to certain cabinet seats, you're not as critical of him. The progressives are the last people actually to come out against, like, to say Biden needed to step down when he was clearly over, his age had, declined, because they had really invested a lot in there. So now this has become a philosophy. Now this is a way of life that we have to capitulate because we can get these things that we need done, so to speak. So there's a way that your tactic, and this is true with a lot of things, could become a full-out philosophy if you're not careful. And now you are totally under that system. You're accountable to the bear. You're not even confronting it anymore. You're simply just trying to say, hey, we need to share some of your honey, right? Can you? And the bear, if the bear is fat and happy, the bear will share some of his honey for a moment to capitulate to whatever. And then eventually the bear is like, I ain't got to share nothing. And that's Trump, right? Like, I ain't sharing nothing. I'm saying that's what he represents, not him as an individual. But, like, I don't have to share anything. I'm not sharing shit. So now you're in a position where you have no power, like, you fully, because you work for the bear now. You don't have a base. Because you've denounced all the things that are needed to confront the bear in real life, because those things are too far. Those things are too extreme. Those things come with too much human cost, whatever. You fully found yourself totally under, like sleeping with the bear, basically, right? Because you've capitulated so much in trying to get this and trying to redistribute the honey without ever taking it, because you don't want it. Like, the reality of that is something that you're not willing to deal with. And if people are just honest, like, it's scary to mess with a bear, like, quite literally, if we're talking about a bear, like, you don't want to, confronting a bear is not a fun project. I get it.
Absolutely.
But so it's okay to be human and acknowledge that. Like, we're not sitting here standing above that either, but if we're being honest about how you ultimately share the honey, quote unquote, if that's resources, if that's wealth, whatever, then you're the bear can't be the one over the honey anymore. And you might have to confront the bear in ways that, you don't necessarily want to do it. So that speaks to the limitations of it, because, again, like, people don't, it's like there's a way that, particularly in the United States, I'll say, I don't think this is as true elsewhere, where elsewhere I think they're able to hold on to the tactic. Like, even when you're talking about Chile, that was probably more just tactical errors than it was a kind of fantastical belief in something.
Yeah.
And that was also 1973. So we should have learned a lot, I think, but I'm saying, here there's just this way that people start to tell themselves that things aren't really as bad as they once said they were. There's this kind of slippage that occurs intellectually or, mentally, where people just don't really, and I think some of that's because the violence is often just placed into dark corners. It's not so much confronting the everyday, middle class white person or just middle class person in general. It's not necessarily confronting them. So there's this way that you can kind of disassociate, and it's definitely confronting people across the world in a different way than it does here.
Yeah.
So there's a way you can just distance yourself from it and be like, well, it's not really that bad, and I'm good if they throw me a small little, prickling of honey. That's good enough,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would just say, summed up in one sentence, it's like the closer you get to the honey, the more you must be prepared for violence. And I think that kind of sums up what we're getting at. And again, no shade to the DSA. I think it's a formation that has to exist. I think it's good that there are candidates out there, for all my critiques of them and as far to the left of them as I am, that they are in the electoral arena, on that terrain, getting people to think in different ways. And I think it makes people more susceptible to moving further left. There have been many people that have been brought in to left-wing politics through a figure like Bernie Sanders, who over the course of a few short years have themselves moved far to the left of Bernie Sanders and now critique him from the Marxist left. So I think there's absolutely a role to play. And I also want to say that there are plenty of caucuses and comrades within the DSA who nod in agreement at every single syllable that you and I said and see it very clearly. So I'm not trying to, the DSA itself is a sort of ecosystem of different caucuses and thoughts and lines, and so I don't want to like pretend it's a monolith either.
No, I agree. And again, it's more so just speaking to these strategies as a whole, right, and how they sometimes do fall victim, to the pitfalls that stand in front of them. And I think it also goes to, this is maybe a little more abstract point, but something I talk with sometimes, even when I'm talking to Black folks, there's but it's not limited to us by any means, but just this tendency to want to call out hypocrisy in and of itself and thinking that will have some inevitable great ending to it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by that is people sometimes are very much bothered by the fact that certain individuals in society can get away with things that others can't. And that's from racial, class lines, gender lines, etc. People can be very annoyed at that and will spend a lot of time on social media or something expounding on how terrible it is that a group of people can get away with something that you can't get away with, or a group of people can do something that you're not allowed to do, or they can engage in a behavior that someone else is punished for. And I think it's important to note that kind of hypocrisy. That is a form of heightening contradictions. But there becomes a thing sometimes, I think, where that becomes a point in of itself, to just name that, to just name how bad something is, just name that this is a hypocrisy, or that this is unfair, that the ruling class can do this and we can't, or white people can do this and we can't. And it's important to like start there. But if you get stuck there, like you're just kind of in a circular motion at that point. You just name hypocrisy, and you just and because the system is what it is, you're gonna always have new hypocrisies to name. And at what point do you figure out how to confront it? Right? Like, so there's a way that, because there's so much commentary nowadays that people are just naming hypocrisy. I was joking with somebody the other day, I called it in this kind of hot potato radicalism, where you name something and hope someone else picks up the gun that you won't pick up, right? You point out a flaw and hope someone else does something about it, and we just bounce around hoping somebody else acts on it. Because the best we can do is just name something. And sometimes it's true that that's all you genuinely have the power to do. So I'm not talking about those people, but I'm talking about the habit of just naming hypocrisy for the sake of it, and how that just becomes a kind of dead end after a certain point. And I just think that's part of the problem when confrontation is not really the main thing on the table.
Yeah, and like in the MAGA movement in particular, they don't give a fuck. Like, they don't believe in anything. Like, they spent years talking about stop the groomers, save the children, Pizzagate, Podesta and Clinton are eating children in the bottom of a whatever. Alex Jones spent decades talking about a globalist pedophile cabal, and then the real thing is actually here, and they all just shrug their shoulders and say, "I'm sick of hearing about it." It's just like they don't give a fuck. Like, pointing out hypocrisy is just telling other lefties, "I see it too." But the right will just be like, I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance or it's just the raw pursuit of power and domination. They don't fucking care.
No, it has no impact. We've seen all of those things go away. It was just propaganda. Like, it was just straight up propaganda. Free speech is propaganda.
Constitution is propaganda.
Yeah, bashing identity politics. Why, that's literally what y'all are engaged in. Like all of those things were, propaganda, anti-Semitism, whatever, right? Like, all of that propaganda, that's not, and again, propaganda has its utility, clearly, because a lot of folks were swept up in it and they thought that, Trump was going to drain the swamp this time or whatever. Like, this, it's laughable, to those of us who know better, but, liberals do the same thing, hold their feet to the fire, hold them accountable, push them to the left. Like, that stuff's honestly not much better. But so it's just again, I don't want to be cruel. I think people really be desperate, man. So they cling to whatever you throw at them sometimes, because they just be desperate. And capitalism does that. It makes people desperate. But nonetheless, these things are not helping move the needle, honestly, at this point. They're just not.
Absolutely. So getting back to Palestine, you compare the Great March of Return and Al-Aqsa flood to argue the oppressor's aim can be method dependent. Can you kind of walk us through that and what exactly you mean and what that reveals about the nature of colonial power, strategy, the bear more broadly?
Yeah, let me look at the piece real quick. I forgot to pull that quote. Um, this extends beyond a just metaphor. For example, in Palestine, land is the honey, so Zionists kill Palestinians for it. They kill them when they peacefully confront them on their feet. That would be the Great March of Return. And even more when they forcefully confront them with arms, the Al-Aqsa flood. Neither a knife nor a hug makes a difference. They want the land, right? So it's just really following that metaphor with the bear, but saying that it's beyond a just metaphor. That was a play on words, like instead of just saying just a metaphor. But this isn't just like a great idea. Like, no, this is how it works. Like if, the Great March of Return, there had been a blockade on Gaza up to that point. I think that was 2018-ish. Don't quote me on that. But up to that point, it was like 11 or 12-year blockade on Gaza since people who, rightfully lived there were trying to return. And just in one day, Israel shot 59 people dead, right? And these are people who, by and large, were returning without any guns. This definitely was not an October 7th situation or anything. People were just hands up, peacefully. All the words we hear were returning, and they were shot down. And it goes to kind of show the limitations of, again, the sacrificial violence that certain people, particularly Palestinians, and Mohammed El-Kurd talks about this in his latest book, but that people just see them and they're almost like characters to us that are supposed to die. Like that's how we treat Palestinians. So their death actually has no effect, unfortunately, on most of the world beyond just virtue signaling. It's because it's almost like baked into how the regular things are supposed to go. So that's why it took so many, and it's continued to take so many of them to die for folks to find a conscience. Now we know that people who've had a conscience the whole time about this, but for a while, you have all these articles that have came out the last year about how I'm now against this, after 2 years of slaughter, like, oh, I'm now against genocide. Like, okay. So there's a certain way that, that doesn't have an effect. But to your question, I could go off on that all day. But to your question, Israel is a illegal, occupation, a project. That's what it is. It's stolen land. That's what the entire project is, not just the parts that Palestinians live on now, the whole thing. And, they don't care, again, how you confront them because they're not giving up the land. If anything, they just want to keep expanding it. That's the greater Israel project or whatever, right? Like They think they're the whole Middle East if you let them tell it. So they're not sharing the land, and there's no appeal to them. I don't think Palestinians were trying to appeal to Israel at all. I'm sure they're way past that point. But they were at least trying to appeal maybe to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, as usual, was unable to come through. But the enemy does not care in this case, particularly Israel, whether you march and return or whether Al-Aqsa flood. The only difference that they make is they just see one as a reason to kill more people than the other, because they're like, oh, now that they actually like rose up with arms, not just rocks or stones or like straight up arms, like, oh, now we really can go ham and just wipe them out. Like it just gives them more justification. So again, we talked about the body count earlier in the sense that you are maybe facing more, but that's the only difference. They say, oh, this is just a reason to go even further. This is just a reason to intensify what we're already doing. But like I said, neither a knife nor a hug makes a difference. They want the land. They're not, they just don't make the distinction. And so like you said, it's method independent. Because we have to be clear thinking about what does the enemy actually want? What is the thing that they want, and how are we threatening that? If we're talking about this from an organizing perspective, how are we threatening that, and how are they going to be willing to respond to us threatening that? That's it. If you're threatening it, you're threatening it. How you threaten it is just a simple question of what is better to get you get you your objectives met. So maybe a Marshall return is a better way to get your objectives met than an Oscar flood. Maybe, I'm talking about metaphorically speaking. Maybe, maybe not. But those are the only questions I think we need to be asking ourselves. Even when we're talking about DSA, maybe even if we understand the limitations of this space, maybe the electoral space is one of the better ways to struggle compared to something else because we don't have the kind of forces elsewhere. Those are arguments I think people should continue to have. It's not that they're not already having them. Those are real arguments to have because it's just a question of what is going to advance our goals, not the morality of it so much. The morality is the fact that we're trying to get free. That we already have the moral high ground. We don't need to argue anything else. Like we already got that because we're oppressed. We don't need anything else to really make the case. So whatever gets you there is really for me the question. And if people can make a case that the nonviolent, or as I'm calling sacrificial violent methods, are the ways that get you there, then I'm not out here just shooting everybody up. So obviously I'm open to that perspective. But I'm just saying at the end of the day, we do have to think about it in that sense, what gets us there, and stay focused on that, and not do like what I said earlier, where you get lost in the soup of it, and now you're all of a sudden like cozying up with the bear when you originally were just trying to figure out tactically how to defeat the bear. Now you're like on this bear's side, and now you're still lying to yourself, telling yourself that, well, if you work with the bear, you can like secretly get them to do what you want. Like that's not how this works. The bear never really loses focus. That's us that do that. So like they know what they want. They're pretty clear on that.
Yeah. And, I think that's so important. And exactly to your point, I think to build off of that, the issue with settler colonialism, as you made clear, is that the land is the honey. And so even when we're talking about nonviolent versus violent approaches to trying to, self-determine in that context from a national liberation perspective, it's not even deeper than that. It's your very existence on the land. So even if you decided, I'm not going to protest at all, right? Like I'm not even going to do the nonviolent or violent. I'm just going to keep my head down and try to get by. The Palestinians are still being killed. They're still being slaughtered. Same exact concept with the U.S. settler colonialism. It didn't matter how the indigenous people of North America resisted, whether they resisted violently, nonviolently, or just tried to live their own life in their own territory. They were still slaughtered because the land is the honey. And insofar as you're on it, your existence is a threat to the bear because the honey is underneath your feet. And so settler colonialism in particular is so nefarious because no matter what you do, even if you do nothing, you will still be killed.
Yeah. It's funny, something doesn't align perfectly with what you said, because I think land is important here, but it's funny. I was reading some Dr. King stuff, and he was talking about he finds it interesting that people, when they would say they couldn't come out to a protest or something, he's talking particularly about men who said they can't come out to a protest because they're going to get shot, or not get shot, but they don't want to get spit on, or they can't let somebody hit them. Like they'll have to respond. Like they're not going to take it. And he was like, well, you get spit on every day and y'all don't do anything. So it's like, I'm paraphrasing it, but he basically said is like, you get spit on every day, all the time. He was like, all the nonsense that happens to us all the time, you don't really do much. So coming out to a rally or something can't be much different than your day-to-day life. Like basically, like at least if you're doing it here, you're doing it to try to win something, right? So it's to say, like, to your point, this violence happens even if you take out the confrontation and you just are living. This is going to happen to you, particularly in the case of Palestinians, because they're on land that someone wants, that someone is not willing to concede under any circumstances unless they're met with the same force, right? So you are forced into a situation where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, quite literally. So you have to think about it in that sense. So if you want to just put your head down and go to work and all of that, that's when no one's going to judge you, or I'm not going to judge you for that. But it doesn't mean you can necessarily avoid what is an inevitable thing, even when we get outside of the conversation of confrontation, because especially when it's someone like in Israel, it's all encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
It kills people who have nothing to do with it, as we see it, as people who are not, who's never kidnapped anyone, who's never shot anybody, who's never even thrown a stone. It will just, you can just get shot in the West Bank, just being in the vicinity of some IDF soldier who's mad at a kid one day and just randomly goes off, or some settler that goes off and kills someone. Like, this can just happen to anybody,
Mm-hmm.
because, this is a war that really doesn't discriminate, right? So, and that death will be just as dismissed likely as the one of somebody throwing the rock or shooting a gun, particularly in that context, right? So, yeah, like, you're living in a situation of people who are relentless. And I think, I'm curious what you think about this, and maybe this leads to even what we're talking about with this question of suffering and cleansing. But there's been sometimes within like the humanist contemporary spaces, like, this people who don't believe in evil effectively,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't, as even as someone who's not religious at all, I genuinely, I do believe in evil.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I do, I think you can materially see it. I don't think it's some, spooky concept. And I think sometimes us not wanting, like, everything being relative, morally relative, sometimes I just feel like we're not really grappling with evil sometimes. Like, just the depths of just how horrible and heinous things really are. It's almost as if we dismiss it for something. Like, that's even people who are materialists sometimes do that, I think, too much. That's that gross materialism Marx talks about, where it's you're not really reckoning with what's really in front of you and how heinous and how much of a threat it really is. Because when we really just, as we're talking, I'm just thinking about, like you say, you're living in a place where somebody can literally take the shit from you, and that makes you a threat because you just exist on land. Like, that's really horrible, morally speaking. But, like, it's like we don't quite want to deal with how horrible that is, because what you would have to do in response to that level of evil, I don't think a lot of us are willing to do. So it's easy to say I don't believe in evil in that sense,
Yeah, I think there's a tendency towards reductionism in materialism broadly that can, in its vulgar forms, can try to reduce everything down to so base a substance that it collapses things like morality in its totality. And so that's, I think, the vulgar aspect you're getting at, when I think dialectics brings that back into focus and says this is a real dynamic here going on, and I think there's a moral, spiritual force to seeing evil as it is. Like, there is evil in the world, and that doesn't have to come with a certain set of metaphysics, but it does have to come with a certain sort of moral clarity, that it's not just about raw material needs, although that is the base of the conflict. There is evil. Whether, like, look at the Epstein files, right? Like, there's no material need for the ruling class to rape and traffic children, but they do it because they are evil and because they believe themselves to be so intrinsically superior to everybody else that they live above not only normal morality but normal sets of laws, and that nobody's there to hold them accountable. And because they already have everything that a normal person might want, all the money in the world, all the power in the world, the desiring for more, the desire for total domination, manifests itself in that sort of profound moral degeneracy. So yes, I do think evil absolutely exists, and it's not the whole puzzle, but it is a crucial part of it. And I think speaking in moral terms, and not always centering, but always creating room for the moral critique of the system, speaks to people on a level that sometimes mere materialist analysis simply doesn't, because it speaks to your heart. It gets people emotionally invested in the fight against this rotten, evil fucking system. And so I do think it's important in that way.
No, for sure. Yeah, I think it's, I think sometimes there's a retreat too much. I mean, even, it's not just even materialist. I was at I don't know how I got involved in this, but I was speaking for some progressive church, and I did a thing called Materializing Evil. That was literally the name of it. Like, or Materializing the Devil, that's what it was called. Like, we can actually see the devil in, like, poverty and shit like that, right? Like, we can see it in these terms. Whether we believe in some kind of force outside of nature, that's different. But, like, this is demonic in every way that your book defines. I was just trying to, I was trying to like connect with the audience. So I put it in their terms.
Totally.
But you know, it was wild to know. I don't want to get too far away from the questions here, but it was just wild to see. I don't say wild, but it was odd that even some of them in that progressive Christian space had moved away from like concepts of the devil and evil. Like they didn't really believe in it.
Yeah, that is interesting.
So it's not even just like Marxists or, you know, like materialists or you know, atheists or non-believers or whatever. You know, it's even in those spaces, there's a certain agnosticism to evil, you know, which is odd to me, you know, considering the world we're in.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is odd, and I totally understand your point of speaking in religious terms to that audience, and I always argue that religion is a terrain of struggle, and I think religion also represents a genuine sphere of human knowledge insofar as it's a unique attempt to try to deal with questions that are just outside of science or morality or even philosophy. It's trying to deal with the deepest existential questions and how we relate to infinity, to the eternal, what our lives mean in the context of the cosmos as we understand it. And there is a rhetorical force, a moral force to operate on that terrain and to speak in that language. And using something like, I'll say like you know, like this Christian nationalism is what is actually meant by using God's name in vain, right? Using God's name in vain does not say is not like don't say God damn it,
right?
You know, it means don't use God and Jesus's name as a fig leaf to advance a system or a movement that stands against every single thing that a loving God would stand for, or that Jesus Christ himself spent his life messaging about. Like that is literally anti-Christ. It doesn't mean you have to believe in some supernatural force necessarily, but it's just like even from a material perspective or just the logical coherency of the system itself, this is a anti-Christ movement that is using God's name in vain. And I think there's something powerful in putting it in those terms.
Yeah, I think that's as some people say, that's a good word. but yeah, I think that's. Yeah, you're literally using the name in vain to, you know, to advance imperialism, to advance murder, to advance genocide. Like that should be appalling, right? But again, if we're thinking about, like, you know, Engels talks about idealism is an abstraction to another abstraction. So you just don't get to, like ultimately do anything about it, because it's just like, that's why I was saying earlier about the hypocrisy part, which might seem like I'm contradicting myself, but it's in terms of, we call out the hypocrisy, but you know, you gotta do something. But then I'm saying you still need to know that this is evil, but that just needs to inspire you to do more than just be like, this is bad. Like I think that's also the problem with morality in a liberal sense, is it's just, like I said, it's just naming. It's just catharsis to say that it happened. And it's like, no, if someone's using your God's name in vain, like, you know, that should be the end of it.
Absolutely.
And I was reading some of the pacifists and the abolitionists, and this is reading Lasordo's book on nonviolence, and he was quoting some of them, like Charles Stearns and others, and they were very clear for them. You know, they really did wrestle with their faith in, you know, facing the South. And they ultimately came to decide that we're going to have to stand with the Union. Not that the Union was amazing, but at least it's going to end slavery or something like that. They were like, we can't do this anymore. Like they were very clear that we have to, you know what I mean? Some of them were very explicit if you read some of the language. I was reading it on a few other podcasts, but they were like, you know, these are not even human beings. Like, I don't believe in killing human beings. These are not human beings. Like that's how
I feel about the Epstein class.
Yeah. Like these are terrible individuals, and they need to be taken out. William Lloyd Garrison even said that he thinks slave insurrections were an advancement for humanity because of how bad slavery was. Like, it was just, they had to actually grapple with it, because originally they were like, we want to end this non-violently, we want to end this through procedure, and they realized like that just can't happen. You know, like we're gonna have to do something more. And again, I acknowledge that these things are not comfortable to really think about, because it does upend a lot of the life most of us live. But I mean, you know, you either do it or you don't. I don't know. You know. Like, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So I have many. I could keep talking on that, but let's let's go ahead and move forward. Let's touch on one or two more questions here as we wrap up. I do want to talk a little bit about your juxtaposition of Martin Luther King Jr.'s redemptive suffering and setting it alongside Fanon's violence as a cleansing force. Right? These are seemingly totally different approaches to the very concept of violence, and a lot of people do treat them as total opposites, but dialectically, there's an interesting sort of synthesis or sort of grappling with the same contradiction that can be uniting of these seemingly disparate opinions. So, just kind of like any thoughts on that and why you used those two figures and those two approaches in the same way in particular.
Yeah, I'll read a few things just to frame that for people. You know, some things you go into an essay, you kind of know you want to touch on. This was actually not one of them. This came up. I did reread Concerning Violence because it just felt like a good grounding to write this, but I didn't really expect to quote it much. But you know, a lot of people have messed with that passage and of the violence cleansing. But, you know, so I'd seen that. And I mean, I grew up in Christian church, and suffering and redemption was very much a part of it. I had never really put the two together, you know, until this essay. So there's a quote from King that I admit is hard to even sit with sometimes. This is something he wrote in his book following the Montgomery bus boycott. And there's a chapter in it, I think it was chapter 7, I think, but it was called My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. And he walks through his kind of intellectual genealogy of how he became what he is. And he, you know, talks through different philosophies and blah, blah, blah. But at some point, you know, he's gotten past that and he's defending nonviolence. And he says, bomb our homes, threaten our children, send your hooded perpetuators of violence into our communities, and drag us out on some wayside road, beating us and leaving us half dead, and we will still love you, but we will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. Now, that's a hard quote to swallow, admittedly. Anytime I read it to people, they're just kind of, you know, like, you know.
Yeah.
Like, especially when we start talking about our children, it's like, not me, you know, like, that's just not, like, that was a tough one, you know. And so originally in the essay, I think I just kept writing, and I didn't really like sit with just kind of how off-putting that is. And so first I was just trying to sit with how off-putting it was, and not just like, you know, sometimes you can drop a quote and you just keep going. And you don't really sit with what someone said. You just kind of use it to reinforce what you're saying. So I wanted to sit with that a little bit. And then as I sat with it, that's when this idea of when Fanon says in Concerning Violence, which is in the broader book of Wretched of the Earth, but the chapters concerning violence, at the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force. And some people take that to say that, you know, Fanon is somehow celebrating violence or he enjoys it, but he's saying that, you know, kind of like a little bit of even what you were saying earlier in terms of evening the odds a bit. You're reclaiming something by returning what the violence has already been imposed on you. There's a certain dignity and respect that you are reclaiming in doing it. You know, even if blood has to be shed, because there's been a certain violence imposed on you as a colonial subject. So you're saying that that violence is cleansing because I have to engage in it nonetheless, even if I'm going to engage in it offensively. Dr. King is saying that there's a level of violence that that needs to happen there's another level of violence and this kind of suffering with violence that needs to happen to change the heart of someone, to bring like respect, as he said, or to redeem his white brethren from a permanent death of the spirit. So there's both of them are acknowledging that someone has to die or someone needs to be hurt in order to restore something, even if it's from very different sides. And I'm sure if you could bring them back from the dead and sit them in the same room, they wouldn't really agree on that.
Yeah.
But for me, when I read it, it was just like, yeah, King in a way is saying, and I'm not taking that, this quote is not out of context. That whole chapter has some of these, like, it has this kind of sense to it, you know, like almost daring people, to kill you, right? But saying that there's a redemptive quality that can transform people, because he felt like violence was it just had a downward spiral to it. It just beget even worse things. That's how King felt. Fanon obviously felt like violence could lead you to a positive place, because it could restore order to what he called a Mankinian world that's been imposed on them by the colonial powers. But in both cases, there's a certain level of violence that needs to be done to bring about a better world. Like, they're both saying it. They're just saying one has to engage in it quite literally. Another has to, in a way, suffer through it, and the Christian doctrine, particularly the ones that the Kings and stuff in the kind of Baptist tradition, but even more broadly, this kind of redemptive, I actually talked to a few theologians to try to work this out, but there's a certain, I think they call it atonement theology, and there's a certain way that you have to die to come back. There's a certain way that people have to go through it to then be reborn. That's even in the idea of Jesus, that someone had to die on a cross very violently, I might add, to then be brought back. And that is really deeply embedded in the faith. But I think sometimes it's not, people deal with the redemptive part and all of the transformative part, but to do that, violence is like the transactional thing that does it. You have to die, you have to be killed, you have to suffer, you have to go through something very horrible. Job's family is killed, which I never really could wrestle with in the book, but Job's family is killed to prove that, that he's faithful. Like, there's this certain kind of suffering that you have to go through. And there's certain scholars that have written and have criticized that, even within the Christian doctrine. Like, my girl's a womanist theologian. She's criticized that. But suffering becomes a kind of like thing that you have to do. But Fanon's not saying we've suffered enough.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not suffering any further. So it's a cleansing force, because it awakens somebody to the reality that they have to face. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I was wrestling with, is seeing like, damn, these things are actually speaking to each other in ways that I don't think we've really sat with before.
I think that's so deep. It literally takes me aback and makes me start contemplating and being forced to sit with that, and these two seemingly oppositional traditions that dovetail in that incredibly interesting way underneath all the rhetoric. And I kind of think, you talk about Job or Abraham having to sacrifice Isaac, or Socrates drinking the hemlock, willing to die for his beliefs, or in the Christian tradition explicitly, right? Jesus Christ being nailed to the cross, screaming out, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," telling his disciples not to resist, to allow his own suffering to occur, to play out. And there's a truth in our lives in a micro way, that in order to become deeper people, in order for our character and our spiritual depth to grow, like, we have to go through suffering, right? A life of comfort and ease and frictionlessness does not produce a strong character. And, the weakest characters are often had and embodied by the most pampered and luxurious people, even in our own society. Look at a figure like Elon Musk. He has all the material comfort he could ever want, and has the character that has never grown past the age of 13, precisely because he hasn't had to suffer, or when he hasn't faced up to it or lived to it in any way that would be a catalyst for depth or growth. And then on Fanon's side, there is a dehumanization. Think about slave revolts, right? A dehumanization in total domination. Like, you are stripped of your humanity by being so firmly under the boot. And to rise up, to rip the boot off of the foot, and to stab the throat of the owner of that boot, there is something redemptive and something rehumanizing by that act of extreme fucking violence. And so it's like, I don't have an easy answer here, and I'm just kind of restating things that you've already said, but it is quite profound to really think through that seeming dichotomy.
Yeah, like, that's what I'm saying. Violence is, because what I'm saying unites it, is the cleansing part, is that in some way violence is cleansing whether it's through literal death or whether it's through you just sort of forms of struggle. But it seems to be that King is saying like, you can do all these things to us and we will still wear you down, right? And that's where you got to respect it, even if it sounds crazy to some people, like the capacity, he says, to suffer, the capacity to overcome, whatever you might throw at me. But it's saying that's the way we're going to cleanse away violence, is our capacity to suffer. That's what the philosophy firmly believed in. And Fanon is saying, we're gonna cleanse away violence by your capacity to suffer. We've already suffered enough. You're gonna suffer, and we're gonna wear you down through your capacity to suffer, because we have experienced such total, as you said, the total boot on our neck. We have nothing left to hold on to. We only thing we have left is to reclaim it, and this is one way we will reclaim it. You've stripped us of so much, that yes, I will reclaim it, and I don't care. Like Malcolm said, we don't care about odds. We don't care about we don't want to hear about that, right? Like this is even that is somewhat, I don't think Fanon was trying to be spiritual, but you could make a spiritual case even for that, because it's to say, I know people, will take issue with maybe gendered language, but when folks say I'm a man, or if you want to take some of that out, I am a human, like you're not going to, I'm still like a living, breathing being, and you're not going to like step on me like I'm not. Absolutely. And that is a reclaiming. And not only you're not going to step on me, like I'm going to get back at you, It's like some people think revenge is inherently bad or vengeance is inherently bad. I think Fanon is saying not really, because you've imposed, like he says, you've imposed this black and white world on me. Like I have no control over that. So it's my job to turn it evenly. It's my job. It's actually justice to bring it back to my side, and this is a way I'm going to do it.
Yeah, and at some point, right, suffering, at some gratuitous point, suffering ceases to offer redemption.
Yeah.
At some point, total, complete suffering with no end in sight fails to provide the possibility of redemption. And I think Fanon is pointing towards that. Like, at the other end of total domination, we've suffered all we can suffer. There's no more suffering that you could impose on us that would have any redemptive qualities. And so at that point, the pendulum must swing back in the other direction. And I have deep love and respect for King and that entire tradition, and I find it fascinating and ponderous, and it makes me want to sit back and just contemplate for sure. But like, there's something deep in my belly that gets lit up when Fanon talks, and like my there's a certain bias my being has in the Fanonian direction.
Yeah, because it's just, I mean, we all have a breaking point, and I think that's why that kind of stuff is relatable. Even when people do it much worse than, like, when people don't, I mean, I not say much worse, when people don't do it nearly as well as Fanon does it, in terms of how they put it, when they even appeal to, the lower traits of ourselves, there's still a part of us that all has a breaking point. And as he talks about who hasn't dreamed of doing these things back, like they've all dreamed of it. Like Fanon wasn't just writing out of his head, like he was a psychiatrist. He's talking to folks all the time. He's hearing the psychology of these folks, and he knows, like, this is the world that's imposed on you. So it's like, no, I'm not gonna sit here and just let you, step on my neck and I do nothing about it. And I think in King's case and stuff, I do think that they're saying, and I've even heard this from even some of the political prisoners I work with, where, they're like, I'm free anywhere. Right? I'm free in prison. You can't, there's like a certain thing I'm not going to let you take from me. And I think that's also what King is saying, like, and others in that tradition, like, there's a certain humanity that your violence will not be able to beat out of me, right? I will still be able to hold on to it even when you do all that. So I get both sides of it. I agree. I more so ride with the Fanon, especially when it actually comes down to it, like in real life. Like, I don't think I'm going to be like, you're not going to you can't take away. Like I probably wouldn't be able to take the perspective the king and them take if I'm really in that position. Like, no, I'm always going to be plotting to see how I can slice your throat. You know, if I'm in the jail cell, like
Absolutely.
I don't know if I could really, you know. But also, I'm not in that circumstance. Like to the respect of both of them, they also went through these things.
True.
You know, they didn't just write about it. So I respect both sides of it, you know, but I found a certain unity there that I had never noticed. That was one of the most surprising parts about writing this.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the most brilliant points. And, you know, hats off to you for exploring that in a way that, in these issues, on these topics, covered these books, covered Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, have never really heard such a deep sort of analysis of that particular dialectic. So, hats off to you. So we have more questions. I don't know. I'm kind of up against a hard stop point on my end. I just want to maybe, as a way to wrap this conversation up, give you the floor to say anything else that you weren't able to mention about the essay thus far. Any last words in general, and then after that we can move into maybe lessons to take away from this and where people can find you and your work online. But I want to give you the chance to say anything that you felt like you haven't said yet.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't get as much into the historical examples, but I think that's why people have to actually read the essay, so we don't really have to touch too much on those. I think they're helpful to frame and ground the argument. I'm working on part 2 now, and part 2 is more part of why I was willing to engage more the kind of conversation we did today, because it's kind of helps me think through part 2, because part 2 is more like I think I established fairly well that, this is violence, and part 2 is still attempting to establish that. This was originally just supposed to be one essay, so I've had to kind of rework how part 2 was, where part 2 is a lot of what was supporting the first argument, and now I have to make a different one to an extent to make it even worth reading. Otherwise, it's just an addendum, which I don't want to write that. So part 2 is just wrestling with, I think I might even have the opening line. I'll just read the opening line. Let me see here. Here it is. Yeah, when living under oppression, even the gunk underneath its boots can become a weapon, right? And it's like that somehow kind of hit me as something to sit with. Like, so on one hand, I'm trying to say nonviolence, as we've kind of already articulated, doesn't stand above anything, right? It's just as much part of the gunk under the boot of oppression as, violence or armed struggle is. It doesn't, it's a response to being caught up in all this gunk, and you are having to use gunk as a weapon because the neck is so deeply on your neck that you can't even reach for anything else. So nonviolence comes out of that too. As much as it tries to be idealist, it can't really escape the fact that it's right there with everything. Everybody else is trying to figure out a way. The people who swing, stab are just as much right next to the folks that do, that are willing to take the swing and the stabbing, right? Like, they don't stand above it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yes, that's true. But at the same time, there's a respect for, people are, since they are under the boot, they have to make concessions sometimes to get up from under the boot, right? We can respect that too. Like, they're not, none of these decisions should be understood, since we're already critiquing idealism. None of these decisions should be understood as these easy decisions that one should make when you are facing Bull Connor or the French or any of these entities. Everything is going to be colored by that, right? Like, there's no getting around that. So trying to combine those two things, but then it also says, in a way, like, nonviolence is kind of more of a propaganda than it is a reality, because it's like, it needs a moral high ground, but it's not to like move forward. But in reality, it's not really doing nonviolence, like I say. So the other two arguments I'm making is, like, you have to either become a state or collaborate with the state. And to do that, you have to engage in violence, because the state's not nonviolent. No matter if you want to call it capitalist, socialist state, I don't really care. It's like a state either has to defend if you're an independence movement, you have to defend your independence, and you're not going to be able to defend that through hunger strikes and, nonviolent action. You're going to have a military to do that. And if you are a movement within a country like the civil rights movement, you're going to have to appeal to some extent to parts of the state to enforce the laws that protect you.
Mm-hmm.
And those laws are not enforced through harmony and love necessarily. They're enforced through the fact that someone has a gun, that somebody has a prison to put somebody in, that somebody can enforce a law, and if it's not followed, they can inflict some kind of penalty on it, right? So, but as long as nonviolence can maintain a certain level of veneer of innocence, like it can appear like it's that, it almost can disassociate from the very things it has to engage to even like progress or advance its own struggle. So that's what I'm working through in the next one, just to kind of give people a sense of what's to come.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, open invite. I would love to have you back on to discuss that piece once it's fully finished. And I'll link to this in the show notes. There is things we couldn't get to. There are historical examples that really flesh some of these lines of argument and lines of thought really out quite well. And it's really the first part is not a long read. I think you can read it in under 15 minutes, even close reading under 15 minutes. So I encourage people who have been at all inspired or motivated by this conversation to dive into the piece itself and all of your other work, right? I've had you on the show several times at this point to discuss your book and your other work. And I want to make sure people can find that. So where can people find you, your podcast, and your other work online?
You can find me at Black Liberation Media. That's where we do our podcast at on YouTube, or you can just find Black Myths Podcast on Spotify, Apple, and everywhere else where you listen to it. You can find me at sometimes I have too much shit I'm involved in, man. But to-black.com. I'm also a poet. Also, I don't really, maybe one day I need to come on here and actually talk about poetry, but also had done that most of my life. Don't do it as much. So you can find me through that. But more than anything, like I talked about political prisoners, you can support the Pendleton 2 at pendleton2.com. That's just the word Pendleton and the number 2.com. And I'm also a member of Black Alliance for Peace as well.
Absolutely. Huge shout out to Black Alliance for Peace, and I'll link to your podcast, pendleton2.com, your website, all of that in the show notes, so people can find you. And of course, we do have other episodes with you. So if you enjoy this conversation, go check those out. They're all on different topics, and they're all incredibly important. I really appreciate all the work you do as an organizer, as a thinker, as an intellectual, as an artist. It's really inspiring, and you bring a depth of analysis and a clarity to some of these questions that I really deeply appreciate. So thank you so much for coming on, and it's without a doubt that we'll talk again soon.
No, for sure. Thank you. Definitely appreciate it. Always love this show.